On November 24, 1971, a man walked into an airport in Portland, Oregon, bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, and sat quietly on a passenger plane. Less than an hour later, he had taken control of the flight. A few hours after that, he disappeared into the darkness with $200,000 in ransom money. The plane landed safely. The passengers survived. The police searched for him. The FBI launched one of the longest investigations in its history. But the man was never found. Even stranger, nobody could prove who he really was. The world would come to know him as D.B. Cooper, but that wasn't actually the name he used, and that small mistake would become part of the mystery. The man who boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 that afternoon called himself Dan Cooper. He was described as a quiet man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark business suit, a white shirt, and a black tie. Nothing about him appeared especially unusual. He bought his ticket with cash. It was a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle. The flight was short. There were only 36 passengers on board. The aircraft was a Boeing 727 at first. Everything seemed completely normal. Cooper took his seat. He ordered a bourbon and soda. The aircraft took off shortly after 3 p.m. Then, somewhere during the flight, Cooper handed a flight attendant a note. At first, she apparently did not realize what she was looking at. Cooper indicated that she should read it. The note said he had a bomb. He then showed her an attaché case containing what appeared to be wires and red-colored sticks. Whether the device was actually a bomb has never been conclusively established, but the flight attendant believed it was real. Cooper's demands were simple. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills. He wanted 4 parachutes. And he wanted the money and parachutes brought to the aircraft after it landed in Seattle. The crew informed the authorities. The passengers were not told exactly what was happening. The aircraft continued towards Seattle. On the ground, law enforcement began preparing for the hijacked plane. Nobody knew exactly who Cooper was. Nobody knew what he intended to do next. But the authorities agreed to his demands. The aircraft landed in Seattle. The passengers were released in exchange for the ransom money and parachutes. Most of the people on board walked away. But Cooper did not. He kept several members of the crew with him. The plane took off again. This time, Cooper wanted the aircraft headed toward Mexico City. The situation had become even stranger. The passengers were gone. The aircraft was back in the sky. The money was with Cooper, and the hijacker was now alone with the flight crew. But Cooper had another plan. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Nevada, shortly after 8 p.m., he disappeared from the aircraft. He jumped from the back of the plane with one of the parachutes and the ransom money. The pilots continued flying. Eventually, the aircraft landed safely. But Cooper was gone. Nobody saw him again. At first, investigators expected to find him. The FBI immediately began searching for him. The investigation was given the code name NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. Agents interviewed witnesses. They examined the aircraft. They followed leads across the country. They investigated people whose appearance or background seemed to match the descriptions given by the flight attendants. But the problem was obvious. They did not even know the man's real name. The ticket had been purchased under the name Dan Cooper. The famous name D.B. Cooper appeared later because of a media mistake. Somehow, the incorrect name stuck. And eventually, the entire world knew the mystery man as D.B. Cooper. The FBI had descriptions from the flight attendants. They knew roughly what Cooper looked like. They knew what he had worn. They knew what he had demanded. They knew the amount of money he had taken. They knew he had jumped from the aircraft somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. But they did not know where he landed. That was the biggest problem. The region below was enormous. It was nighttime. The weather was poor. And much of the area was heavily forested. If Cooper survived the jump, he would still have to find his way through difficult terrain. If he did not survive, his remains could have been hidden somewhere in a vast wilderness. The FBI searched. Nothing conclusive was found. Then, nearly 9 years later, something extraordinary happened. In February 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was playing along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He noticed something buried in the sand. It was a package containing decaying $20 bills. The serial numbers were checked. They matched some of the ransom money given to Cooper in 1971. There was $5,800 in total. It was the only confirmed portion of the ransom ever recovered. And suddenly, the mystery became even stranger. If Cooper had survived, why had some of his money ended up along the Columbia River? Had he buried it? Had it been carried there by the river? Had someone else found it? Or had Cooper himself died somewhere in the region? Nobody knew. The discovery proved that at least some of the ransom money had reached the area, but it did not reveal what happened to Cooper. Investigators continued considering suspects. One of the most famous was Richard Floyd McCoy. McCoy was a skilled skydiver who hijacked an aircraft less than 5 months after the Cooper hijacking. His crime had similarities. He demanded money. He escaped from an aircraft using a parachute. And investigators wondered whether McCoy could actually have been Cooper. But the FBI eventually ruled him out. The descriptions provided by the flight attendants did not match him closely enough, among other reasons. Other suspects appeared over the years. Some were convincing, some were clearly not. People contacted the FBI claiming to know Cooper's identity. Some believed they had found him. Others claimed that relatives had suddenly acquired unexplained wealth after 1971, but no theory was ever proven. And the FBI eventually had to acknowledge something remarkable. After decades of investigation, they still did not know who Cooper was. There was another important clue. Before jumping, Cooper had removed his black tie and left it on the aircraft. The FBI preserved it. Years later, forensic testing found a DNA sample on the tie. Investigators hoped modern science might finally solve the mystery. But the sample was not enough to identify Cooper. It could not provide the definitive answer investigators needed. The case remained open for decades. Meanwhile, Cooper had become something far bigger than an unknown criminal. He had become a legend. Books were written about him. Television programs investigated the case. Amateur detectives studied maps. People searched the forests and riverbanks. Some became convinced Cooper had survived and lived quietly under another name. Others believed he died during the jump, and there was good reason to consider that possibility. The FBI noted that Cooper's clothing and footwear were poorly suited to the difficult terrain below. He was jumping at night. The weather was unfavorable. He had apparently chosen a parachute that could not be steered, and there was no confirmed evidence that he had extensive experience with parachuting. If he landed safely, he still had to survive the wilderness and disappear without leaving a clear trail. It was possible, but it was far from certain. The FBI's investigation continued for 45 years. Agents followed thousands of leads. They interviewed hundreds of people. They examined evidence. They searched. They tested theories. But Cooper remained missing. Finally, in July 2016, the FBI announced that it was redirecting resources away from the active investigation. The Bureau had spent decades trying to solve the case. No definitive identification had been made. No confirmed sighting had emerged. No body had been found. No parachute had been conclusively recovered, and only $5,800 of the $200,000 ransom had ever turned up. The case was effectively placed into the history books, but the mystery itself never disappeared. That is what makes D.B. Cooper's story so unusual. Most famous criminals are eventually identified. They are arrested. They stand trial. They go to prison. Their story has an ending. Cooper's story does not. There is a beginning. There is a hijacking. There is a ransom. There is a parachute. Then there is nothing. No confirmed identity. No confirmed death. No confirmed escape. Just an empty aircraft and a mystery. And there is another detail that makes the story even stranger. The man himself seemed determined to leave as little information behind as possible. He used the name Dan Cooper. He paid cash. He did not give investigators a real identity. The FBI later confirmed that the initials DB were essentially a product of the press. So even the name attached to the mystery was wrong. We do not know who he was. We do not know exactly where he landed. We do not know whether he survived. And we do not know what happened to the rest of the money. But there are theories. Some investigators believe Cooper probably died during or shortly after the jump. The conditions were dangerous. The terrain was difficult. And no confirmed trace of him was ever discovered. Others believe he survived. They point to the fact that no body was found and that only a small portion of the ransom was recovered. Perhaps he landed safely. Perhaps he reached a road. Perhaps someone helped him. Perhaps he disappeared into ordinary life under a completely different name. But there is no proof, and that is where the story must remain, because a good mystery does not become fact simply because the theory sounds convincing. The FBI officially stopped actively investigating the case in 2016, but the Bureau made one thing clear. If credible physical evidence connected to the parachutes or ransom money ever appeared, investigators would still want to know about it. So the door was not completely closed. It was simply no longer being actively searched. More than 50 years after the hijacking, the mystery remains. The world still does not know who D.B. Cooper really was. There have been countless suspects. Some looked convincing, some confessed, some were investigated extensively, but none was proven to be Cooper. And perhaps the strangest part is that Cooper did not vanish from a remote island or disappear behind an elaborate secret passage. He disappeared from the sky. One moment, he was inside a passenger aircraft, then he jumped, the pilots landed, the FBI searched, and the man was gone. His disappearance changed aviation security in the United States. The hijacking era was taken much more seriously. Airports introduced stronger security measures. The era when a passenger could simply board an aircraft with almost no screening was coming to an end, but Cooper himself remained beyond reach. In 1980, the discovery of the ransom money briefly brought the mystery back to life. In 1994, forensic testing was used on the tie. In 2016, the FBI stepped back from the active investigation. And still no answer. Today the case remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. The FBI has a name for the case. The public has a legend, and somewhere between those two is the truth. Maybe Cooper died in the wilderness that night. Maybe he survived and lived quietly for decades. Maybe his real identity has been guessed but never proven. Or maybe the answer is sitting in some forgotten piece of evidence that nobody has recognized yet. What we know is simple. On November 24, 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a flight in Portland. He hijacked the aircraft. He He demanded $200,000 and parachutes. He released the passengers. Then he disappeared from the aircraft somewhere over the Pacific Northwest. He was never found. Only $5,800 of the ransom has ever been recovered. His real name remains unknown. And more than half a century later, there is still no confirmed answer to the most basic question of all. Who was the man who walked onto that plane, and where did he go after he vanished into the night?